So this lesson is all about the topic called absorption of materials. So this is subtopic 7, absorption of materials. What this topic is going to be looking at is it's linking some of the stuff from our cells unit to what we've just been looking at. So thinking about respiration, diffusion, and then tying it to what we've just been looking at in terms of transport systems in animals. So things like our heart and blood vessels and the blood itself. So there are some questions that you can maybe have a wee look at just as a starter, just to recap what you've just been looking at. So you can feel free to pause the video and give those questions a go. And when you're ready, we'll continue on. I'm going to look at absorption of materials. So in this topic, one thing that we really need to consider is aerobic respiration. So first of all, where does this process take place? And the answer to that question is that it takes place inside all living cells. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about a simple single-celled life form like a bacteria or something more complex like ourselves. Every living cell has to be able to carry out aerobic respiration. And within those cells, it would take place in the cytoplasm for the first stage, and then the mitochondria for the second stage. So for aerobic respiration to take place, we need to think about the two substances that cells require. So we've got glucose plus oxygen gives us energy, carbon dioxide, and water. So what this is telling us is that all cells do need glucose and oxygen. So where do these things actually come from? Where do cells get their supply of glucose from? Where does the oxygen come from for all this respiration to take place? Now, for large organisms like ourselves, the cells that are deep within us, for example, inside the muscles in your legs, they cannot just absorb glucose and oxygen from their surroundings. And we spoke about that in the transport systems topic. So for glucose and oxygen to get to all the cells, it has to be transported there via the blood. However, we also need to think about how the blood actually gets these things. So where does the glucose come from and where does the oxygen come from inside our bodies that then goes into the blood? And the answer for this is that the glucose comes in through our digestive system and the oxygen comes in through our lungs. So we breathe in the oxygen and we breathe out the carbon dioxide as well, but we also take in glucose when we eat. That gets broken down by digestion. We then have to consider how it then gets into the blood for it to be transported to all the cells that ultimately need it. And the answer is that these things have to diffuse into the blood. Oxygen and glucose have to diffuse into the blood, in this case, from a part of our digestive system, and in this case, from our lungs. So that's what we're focusing on, is the absorption of materials. How do they get into the blood, and how are they then passed on to where they are needed? So if we consider the circulatory system again for a minute or two, we've got some of the blood here is blue, some of it is red, and we said in the last lesson that that was to do with the state of the blood in terms of its oxygen. So the veins are predominantly carrying this deoxygenated blood around the body, and the arteries are carrying this oxygenated blood around the body. But blood moves around the whole system, and as it does so, it drops things off and it picks things up. So if we consider the heart, first of all, the heart's pumping blood out here through the pulmonary arteries into the lungs, where they then pick up oxygen. And it then comes back to the heart, and then it gets pumped out again through the aorta to all of the different tissues within the body. So inside the liver is an organ, and it's made up of specialized cells, which together form tissues, liver tissue, that ultimately forms the liver organ. Similarly, in the kidneys, we've got kidney tissue. These are similar cells, kidney cells, that form tissues, and these tissues then form the organ known as the kidney. Throughout our body, we have tissues of similar cells. We sometimes call the areas that sort of surround these tissues as capillary beds. So we're going to zoom in now. It could be any of these areas at all. You can see these sort of mesh-like areas. These are capillary beds within the tissues that make up our organs. So let's zoom in a little bit and see what they are like. So the capillaries here, we've got our artery bringing blood into this capillary bed. And within this capillary bed, we have our cells, body cells. And they're all similar. They're all grouped together as similar cells. That's why we call them a tissue, similar cells working together. I've put 3 here, so I've highlighted 3. So these are 3 cells within this tissue. It could be anywhere in the body. And all of these cells need oxygen and they need glucose. So what will happen is the blood is going to be passing through this capillary bed. And as it does so, it's dropping off materials that are needed and it is taking away waste materials into the vein, and then that'll continue on around the body. So how does, let's say, oxygen, for example, how does the oxygen, as it's passing by, actually get into the cells which need it? Well, think about the fact that the blood at this point has a high concentration of oxygen. These cells have a lower concentration of oxygen. So as the blood passes by carrying this oxygen, the oxygen will diffuse into the cells from a high concentration here to a low concentration here. Similarly, we'll have exchange of materials because this will have a high concentration of waste compared to the blood. So the waste, like carbon dioxide, urea, that will diffuse back into the blood. So capillary beds are areas where exchanges are taking place, and it's all down to diffusion. Now, the actual capillary beds themselves are very, very well suited to their function. And you need to have a little think about why that might be. And think back to the previous lesson where we were looking at the structure of these blood vessels. Why do you think capillary networks are well suited to their function? Well, the first thing is they have a huge number of capillaries. So these capillary beds, you can see that they're highly branched. There's huge numbers of capillaries here, which means that we've got a kind of large surface area. We can reach out and contact as many of these cells as possible. So we've got a large surface area. We've got a high number of capillaries, a good blood supply, basically. Remember as well that capillaries are only 1 cell thick, which means materials can diffuse in and out quite easily. That wouldn't be possible in an artery or a vein because they're much thicker. So capillary networks are well suited to their function for quite a variety of different reasons. Hopefully you've managed to pick up a few of them there. Okay, now keep those features in mind because we're now going to look at a few specific capillary beds, a few areas of the body where materials are having to be exchanged. So let's have a little look. First of all, in case you did miss it, at the key features, why all surfaces involved in the absorption material are good at what they do. There's always a large surface area for exchange because there's a good blood supply, large number of capillaries going to that particular area, and we have the thin cell walls, or thin, but of course we know that animal cells do not have cell walls. What we're talking about here is we're considering the wall of a capillary as being 1 cell thick, okay? So the 2 specific examples we're going to look at then are the lungs and the digestive system to look at the oxygen and glucose that we're seeing as key to that aerobic respiration. So let's have a little look at the lungs. Now, it's useful to know a little bit about the structure of the lungs, although you don't need huge amounts of detail here. So the trachea is the main airway that connects to our nose and to our mouth. So we breathe in, air and oxygen will come down through the trachea. It will reach a junction and it will go into 2 slightly smaller tubes called bronchi, or an individual bronchus, 1 into each lung. The bronchus then split off even further into smaller tubes, which we call bronchioles. And at the very end of the bronchioles, we get to what is properly called the alveolus, which is singular, or alveoli for plural. You may have heard of these as called air sacs. Now, in National 5, we need to give them their proper name, so they are alveolus. You do not need to know the specifics about inhalation and exhalation, but you may have picked this up in first or second year. The idea being that the diaphragm drops, which creates a bigger space and a drop in pressure inside the lungs, and that's what forces air in and inflates the lungs. Then when the diaphragm then pushes back up, that increases the pressure in the lungs, which forces air back out of the trachea, and the lungs deflate. So the key point where gas exchange is coming in is effectively between an inhalation and an exhalation. So it has to happen very fast. So let's have a closer look at the alveolus, which we can see here. So there's our trachea, our bronchus, and then down for our bronchioles, and at the very, very end, we've got this, which is our alveolus, or air sac. So the alveolus is a big space inside, a little bit like a deflated balloon. So when we inhale, these will inflate collectively, which makes the whole lung inflate. Now, the actual alveolus are surrounded by capillaries. And notice that this capillary, again, is highly branched because there's a large surface area required, a lot of points of contact between the blood supply and the alveolus there. If we simplify that slightly, just to have a little look. So again, another image, here's our capillaries. Okay, we've got our capillary that's bringing blood in. It's blue at this stage because it's deoxygenated. And then by the time it leaves, it's red because it's picked up oxygen from the alveolus. You can see that here. What's happening inside, when we've inhaled, we've got a high concentration of oxygen. And we've got a low concentration of carbon dioxide. So a swap is taking place, two diffusions, oxygen diffusing from the alveolus into the blood supply, into the capillary, carbon dioxide diffusing from the capillary, the blood supply, back into the alveolus. And then when we exhale, we're going to be taking that air out again, which has now got more carbon dioxide in it. So that is gas exchange. We're swapping oxygen for carbon dioxide, and we're taking away this oxygenated blood. So the alveolus are really, really efficient at doing this gas exchange because there is a huge number of them. There are millions and millions of alveolus within the lungs. So we've got a large number of them. They have got a similar structure to the capillary in that they are only one cell thick, which means it's easy for this gas exchange to take place. And the other reason why alveolus are so good at their job is because they have got a good blood supply. It isn't as simple as this diagram shows, just one blood capillary. You can see it better here. There is a huge number of capillaries contacting the alveolus. So a good blood supply, thin-walled, one cell thick, and we've got this large surface area because there are so many of these alveolus within the lungs. So hopefully that makes sense. That is gas exchange, oxygen for carbon dioxide. So keep in mind the key features that make this exchange efficient. Okay, keep in mind that throughout. Okay, similarly in the digestive system, we don't actually need all of this level of detail, but again, it is just worth pointing out the digestive system is quite complex. So digestion begins in the mouth when we start to chew our food, break it down, mix it with saliva, which contains digestive enzymes, amylase, and that's breaking the food down. That's how it all starts. Mechanically, as we chew, we break it into smaller chunks, and then we swallow that food down the gullet, or esophagus, as it's properly called. And you might remember from first or second year a process called peristalsis, which is the muscular movement that kind of forces the food all the way down and into the stomach. In the stomach, we've got our stomach acid, and we've got other digestive enzymes like pepsin and trypsin, which are breaking down things like protein. And effectively at this point, we're turning our solid food into a more liquid food, which is going to be easier to absorb later on. We've got other organs that help, like the pancreas and liver, which produce more enzymes, the gallbladder, which produces bile to help break down fat. So really, by the time we have actually got our food further down the system into the small intestine, it is now pretty much like soup. It is a liquid, and it's easier to absorb in that form. The key part of the digestive system that we need to focus on is in the small intestine. This is where the absorption of our food and nutrients takes place. So the contact between our digestive system and our blood is here. Okay, anything that we can't absorb or can't use, this is undigested material, that will continue all the way down into the large intestine, and the large intestine will push that up, out, and away, and that is our waste. So it's stored in the rectum and released through the anus when the time is appropriate. So the key exchange, the absorption of materials, is taking place in the small intestine. So let's focus on that and look at why it's good at what it does. So first of all, the small intestine is highly folded. It's huge. It's about 2 meters long, and it has been folded and compacted into a shape that will fit inside our abdomen. Now, the highly folded aspect of it is meaning that it's going to have a large surface area. So there's a large surface area to absorb that food. If this was just one short kind of curved tube that then met up with the large intestine, part of the issue is the food would travel through it so quickly that we wouldn't be able to absorb much of it, and we would have a lot more waste. So the large surface area provides an ample opportunity to absorb as much of that food as possible. Let's zoom in even further and see how the actual tube is shaped, because it's not like a pipe, it's a bit more complicated than that. So here's inside the small intestine. First of all, you'll notice that the walls are kind of how we would call corrugated. So it's not a nice smooth tube, it's a kind of bumpy folded tube, again, increasing the surface area. And then when we zoom in even further and look at that wall, we actually find that within each fold, there are these tiny little projections, which we call villi. And it's the villi that are actually absorbing all of our food, the useful food, into our blood supply. So let's take a look at those villi in even more detail. So you can see them here. The best way to imagine it actually is imagine that the inside of the intestine, we know that it's corrugated like that, sort of folded. But if you were to touch it, it would almost, it's like tiny microscopic carpet-like projection. It'd be like the surface of a carpet, these tiny little villi sticking up. And there's absolutely loads of them. So at the villi, the food that we can absorb is absorbed. And we can see that here. That's the inside of our intestine, that carpet-like structure. Each of these bristles then are the villi. And each villi has a good blood supply associated with it. So you can see that there, this villi has a capillary bed within it. And this is going to absorb the materials from the digestive system into the blood. And we'll have a closer look now at these villus or villi. So first of all, the surface of the villi, again, it is only 1 cell thick. It is very, very thin, which means that materials can very easily move into the digestive system. Move into the blood supply. So outside here, this is our intestine, and this is the surface of it, and we're saying that food would just be absorbed across the thin wall and into the blood capillaries, which we can see here. And as that happens, they'll then be taken away and off and around the body. So the kind of stuff that gets absorbed into the blood supply, into the blood capillaries, is glucose and amino acids, the really sort of small things that we can use. Some other materials like fat products do not go into the blood. They actually go into this big structure behind it, which is called the lacteal. So the lacteal takes away fat products, but the blood capillaries take away the useful glucose and amino acids around the body. So have a look at a slightly different one. So how the villi structure is suited to its function, that is just the fact that it is thin-walled. Again, it has a good blood supply, and there's a large surface area because there are millions and millions of these villi within our small intestine. So it's the exact same reasons as we were talking about with the lungs, okay, same features. Here's the other picture of it. So this just gives you a slightly better view of the lacteal, which is part of a different system that takes away our are fat materials. That's the lymph vessels. We'll not go into any more detail on that at National 5. That's higher human. But the blood capillaries, which you can see surrounding that, they take away the useful amino acids and glucose. Okay, so that is it for this topic. That is absorption of materials. You need to have a good understanding of gas exchange that's taking place within the lungs. You need to understand the villus and how it is taking away the useful materials from digestion. You also need to appreciate what's happening at the tissues of our body. So these blood capillaries that are taking in good things in the lungs and digestive system are dropping those things off at the tissue, at the tissues of the body, at the capillary beds there. So hopefully that makes sense. You should be able to complete your notes on the absorption of materials. And if you do have any questions, remember to get in touch with your teacher.